I titled this When God is Working Behind Closed Doors, or When the Door is Shut. That because I really want us to give consideration to what that looks like. And I know that some of you will be watching on replay, so I want you to hashtag replay when you see this on Facebook and you take a look. So we're in 2 Kings 4, and I want to read to you the passage of scripture, and then I'm going to share a little bit from one of my favorite devotionals, and I'll give you a little bit of background on that, and that way you know what that looks like for me and why it's so significant. So we'll start in 2 Kings 4, verse 1. A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." So Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour it into all the vessels and set aside the full ones." So she went from him, and she shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another vessel." So the oil ceased. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest." What happens when we believe God is at work, even when the door is shut? That's what I want to talk about today. Some observations from 2 Kings 4. The woman went to Elisha. This would be like those of us who, are in the midst of financial challenge because of COVID-19. And we're reaching out. We're contacting people. We're looking for options for how to make things work because so many small businesses are not able to do business because of quarantine and shelter-in-place orders. And so she goes to Elisha, and she's saying, "Hey, my husband's dead. I've got this creditor. He's going to take my sons. He's going to take them as slaves to take care of this debt." And Elisha asks, and he says, "What shall I do for you?" And he says to her something very important. He says, "What do you have in your house?" And she said, "Nothing in the house but a jar of oil." What's important is he asked her, "What do you have in your house?" First of all, she knew what she had in her house. In the time that we're spending sheltered and in quarantine, might be a good time for us to really know what we have in our house. What can we live on? What can we utilize? How can we leverage what we have in our house in order to take care of the needs that we have? It's important. She knew what was in her house. She said, "I have a jar of oil." And so Elisha then gives her some instructions. He tells her, "Go out and borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels." He said, "Do not gather just a few." It's important that, thinking about his instructions to the widow, he said, "You want to gather vessels from everywhere and from all." When you see words like everywhere and all, I take note of those because there's a strong message in there that oftentimes we limit what we believe about what God is able to do. We limit our belief about a God who is limitless. And that's an important lesson for us to learn during this time that we are spending prolonged periods of time in our home, that we truly expand our ability to believe God for more. So we know that they went out and they got vessels, because it says in verse 4, Elisha tells her, and when you come in, you shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it, referencing the oil, into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. Something that many years ago I gathered from the reading of this portion of scripture is that God supernaturally stretched a jar of oil that she had in order to fill many vessels. It was a strong lesson for me on what it means to have the supernatural stretch, the supernatural provision of the Lord. Many of us being affected by COVID-19, we need a supernatural stretch of our time, our energy, our focus, our patience. We need a supernatural stretch of God's provision as well. And much like the widow went and asked, what can be done? And Elisha gave her some instructions, and then she followed those instructions, went back into her home, and she shut the door. And God supernaturally stretched the supply of oil that she had in order to fill every vessel that they had brought in to the house. And ultimately, she was able to sell what that supernatural stretch provided, and it allowed her to pay her creditor, and then it gave her some left over for her and her sons. Right now, what do you have in your home? Is there something that you can sell? Could you put it on Facebook Marketplace? Could you put it on Poshmark? Could you put it out there on Craigslist for a porch pickup? What do you have in your home that God could use to supernaturally stretch the provision that He knows that you need in this season that we're in? I believe that we need to begin to challenge the level of belief that we have over God's ability to be faithful. We put God in a box. We see our limitations. We see the end of our bank account, and it's easy to act in unbelief. And what we need is a Mark 9:24 moment where the Father, when Jesus confronts the Father about if I can do it, and the Father says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. You see, this widow demonstrated her belief because they actually went out and got vessels. And I wonder the conversation that she and her sons had when all the vessels were gone. Did maybe they say to each other, man, we should have gotten more vessels. Man, we should have asked more neighbors. Man, we should have. So what does that look like for you? Do you post it in more places? Do you, private message people who might be looking? Whatever the case is, let's believe God for more, because behind the door that you're shut behind because you're sheltered in place, God is able to do a supernatural work for you and your family. I want to share with you that promised devotional that I talked about. It's called Streams in the Desert. And this is a very special devotional to me because it was given to me by my then best friend, Heather Nolan, and it's dated September 30th, 2006. This is 2 years and a couple of months before she would die of breast cancer. And so this devotional has a very special place in my heart because for Heather, this really helped her to get through some of her darkest days of fighting cancer, and ultimately the days leading up to her homegoing to the Lord. Well, I want to read you April 5th because it really struck me and is what led me to share with you from 2 Kings 4:4. The widow and her 2 sons were to be alone with God. They were not dealing with the laws of nature, human government, the church, or the priesthood, nor were they even dealing with God's prophet, Elisha. They had to be isolated from everyone. Did you hear that word, isolated? They had to be isolated from everyone, separated from human reasoning, and removed from the natural tendencies to prejudge their circumstance. They were to be as if cast into the vast expanse of starry space, depending on God alone, in touch with the source of miracles. This is an ingredient in God's plan for dealing with us. We are to enter a secret chamber of isolation in prayer and faith that is very fruitful. At certain times and places, God will build a mysterious wall around us. He will take away all the supports we customarily lean upon and will remove our ordinary ways of doing things. God will close us off to something divine, completely new and unexpected, and that cannot be understood by examining our previous circumstances. We will be in a place where we do not know what is happening, where God is cutting the cloth of our lives by a new pattern, and thus where He causes us to look to Him. Most Christians, I want you to hear this, most Christians lead a treadmill life, a life in which they can predict almost everything that will come their way. But the souls that God leads into unpredictable and special situations are isolated by Him. All they know is that God is holding them and that He is dealing in their lives. Then their expectations come from Him alone. Like this widow, we must be detached from outward things and attached inwardly to the Lord alone in order to see His wonders. It is through the most difficult trials that God often brings the sweetest discoveries of Himself. Here's a poem that they end with. God sometimes shuts the door and shuts us in, that He may speak, perhaps through grief or pain, and softly, heart to heart, above the din, may tell some precious thought to us again. I want to encourage you, if you are feeling shut behind the door, believe that God is at work. Believe that He is cutting a new pattern in your life. Believe that He is giving you an opportunity to believe Him for more, to trust Him for His provision, to allow Him to supernaturally work in the midst of your circumstances, to make a way where there seems to be no way. Because that's what God did for this widow and her two sons. And I believe it's exactly what God can do for you, whatever your circumstance is. It might not be a jar of oil for you, but whatever it is, God is able to supernaturally provide for you through means that we cannot explain, that we often will not understand, and yet He will use it to deepen our faith, to grow us more closely to Him, to rely on Him more fully and more wholly, and really to get off the treadmill life where everything is within our grasp and we understand and we have expectation of exactly how things will go, and we begin to feel like we've got it all under control. And yet, instead, we choose the unpredictable, we choose the uncertain, and we allow God to work in and through it. I pray that you are encouraged today, because God is able to make streams in the desert. If you're feeling dry from being cooped in, if you're feeling lost from dealing with all the uncertainty, if you're feeling anxiety, whatever it is, I pray that you will allow the thought that God is at work behind your shut door, and He is able to supernaturally give you all that you need. I'm Elizabeth Mahusai, hoping that you have a super day.